My name is Brian, and I'm 23 years old. I live in a quiet suburban Colorado neighborhood, in a house that for a long time seemed like a fortress of habits and memories. But that all changed 7 years ago when Celine came into our lives. My mom died when I was 16. She had fought a long battle with cancer, but the disease was stronger. The house became empty after she was gone, somehow alien, despite my father's attempts to fill the silence. Tom, my father, is a workaholic to the core. He's 55 years old and runs a construction company. His work has always been over the top: blueprints, projects, calls. I saw him mostly in the evening, and even then, he was busy most of the time. One day, about a year after my mom died, my dad said he wanted me to meet a woman. He mentioned her casually, as if he was afraid of my reaction. I didn't know then that this encounter would change everything. I was 16 when I first saw Celine, and I was expecting something very different. But this woman didn't look like her 40s, more like a stylish, confident 30-something. Her brown hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and her eyes were a piercing green color, the kind that when you looked into them, you forgot what you wanted to say. She was elegant, with a casual grace that took your breath away. I was angry then. Angry. My mom had just been buried, and my dad was bringing someone new into the house. He talked about the wedding like it was a given. I didn't understand how he could do that. Didn't he love her? Didn't mom mean everything to him? The evening of the day my father brought her to our house, I stormed into my room and slammed the door shut. I wanted to scream, to hit something, to vent the rage that was tearing me up inside. But instead I just sat on my bed and stared into the void. As time went on, I began to notice that Celine wasn't what I had imagined her to be. She didn't try to impose herself, she didn't claim to be the new mom. On the contrary, she was reserved, but with genuine kindness. Every morning, when she went out into the garden to tend the roses, she looked as if she could be a model. Her slim-fitting jeans and simple white t-shirt looked as if they had been custom-made for her. Celine had some magical ability to adjust to people. She was easy to get along with her neighbors, could get anyone talking, but she never overstepped her boundaries. She stayed out of my business, didn't ask me anything I didn't want to discuss. Her laughter. It filled the house, as if breaking through the very silence that had settled here after Mom's death. Sometimes I caught myself subconsciously listening to hear that laughter. I didn't immediately realize how I began to respect her. At first it was the little things. She took care of the house like the house was her own. She cooked dinner, trying to please both my father and me, always setting the table with a kind of homely warmth. But what shocked me most of all was the way she listened. When I couldn't help myself once again and vented my frustration at her for coming into our lives at all, she didn't make a scene. Instead, she just listened to me without interrupting, and then quietly said, "I could never replace your mother, Brian. I know how much you loved her. But I'm not here to take anything away." Those words stuck in my head. Celine wasn't trying to win me over or please me. She was just being herself, and no matter how much I resisted, I couldn't help but notice how genuine she was. One of the turning points was the evening my father left for another business trip. It was just Celine and me. I was sitting in my room, scrolling through videos on my phone, when I heard her knock on the door. "Dinner's ready if you want it." I replied something inaudible, but still got up and went into the kitchen. She was sitting at the table, wearing a light sweater and jeans. A soft, tired smile on her face. "Thanks for coming out," she said. We ate in silence, but there was no awkwardness in that silence. At one point I looked up and saw her looking at me. Not as an annoyed guy who was always dissatisfied, but as a human being. "You look like him," she said suddenly, nodding toward the picture of my father on the wall. "Stubborn, with a strong character." I didn't know what to say. "You know, he says a lot more about me than I deserve," she continued. "But I want you to know that I don't want to take a place that belongs only to your mom. I just want to be a part of your life." And in that moment, I felt my anger recede for the first time. It was years before I really began to understand my father. Losing someone you shared everything with is scary. He chose Celine not because he wanted to replace my mom, but because she gave him a chance to feel alive again. I can't say I think she's perfect now. But she has earned my respect. Sometimes I think her wisdom and charisma helped our home feel warm again. Celine is more than just a beautiful woman. She is the person who came at the most difficult moment and was able to do what no one expected: give us back our lives. It was an ordinary evening. My father had gone on another business trip, leaving Celine and me alone in our quiet house. I spent the afternoon flipping through my phone and lazily watching YouTube videos. The room was in semi-darkness, the light of the screen reflected off the walls. I didn't think this evening was going to be any different, until a light, barely audible knock on the door brought me out of my reverie. "Brian?" Celine's voice was muffled but warm. She rarely dropped by my door without a reason. I rose from the bed, forgetting I was sitting in just shorts. Before I could answer, the door opened quietly. Celine stood in the opening, her silhouette standing out against the light from the hallway. She always looked like her every gesture was carefully considered, her movements as fluid as a dancer's. She was wearing a simple robe, but even in that homely garb she looked mesmerizing. "I'm sorry to bother you. Just wanted to see if you were okay," she said, stepping inside. I felt awkward, realizing I looked careless. Her eyes quickly glanced around the room and then stopped on me. "It's okay," I said, trying to sound casual. She crouched on the edge of my bed, and the mattress sagged slightly under her weight. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't explain. Celine looked at me, and her gaze seemed too piercing, as if she could see right through me. "You've grown up so much," she said quietly, almost wistfully. I didn't know what to say. Her voice was soft, but there was more than observation in it. She leaned closer and, before I could react, brushed a strand of hair away from my forehead. Her touch was light, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "Do you ever wonder what you want out of life?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. Her question caught me off guard. I've never really thought about it seriously. Celine smiled slightly. Her hand lingered on my cheek for a moment, and then she pulled it away. There was a pause. Silence filled the room, but it wasn't awkward. The tension between us became almost palpable. I could feel my heart start to pound faster, as if anticipating what was going to happen next. Suddenly she leaned closer. Her lips touched mine, gently, almost weightlessly. It was a moment I'd never expected, and so I didn't immediately know how to react. But then everything in me seemed to awaken. I lifted my hand, touched her face, and deepened the kiss. Her lips were soft and warm, with the faint taste of the wine we'd had at dinner. The world around us disappeared. It was just the two of us. Her hand slid over my shoulders, pulling me closer. I felt the warmth of her body, her breath, and it was intoxicating. Celine pulled away slightly, her forehead pressed against mine. We were both breathing hard, like we'd just run a marathon. "This isn't right," she whispered, her voice shaking. Her eyes searched mine, and for a moment I thought she was going to pull away. But instead she leaned in again, and her lips captured mine with more confidence. My hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer. I could feel her trembling as her fingers slid up my chest, exploring every inch of it. It was both gentle and determined, like she wanted to memorize everything. That moment changed everything.
In that second, I realized that our lives would never be the same again.
Her breath was warm and enveloping, barely perceptible against my skin. We stood a few inches apart, and the air between us seemed to tingle with tension. The soft light of the table lamp emphasized the lines of her face, the thin neck, the curve of her shoulders. There was something mesmerizing and dangerous in her every movement at the same time. Her gaze slid over me, intense and deep, as if she saw more than I was willing to show. For a moment we just stood there, not saying a word, but it was enough for me to feel my heart start to race. It made the world around us blur, leaving just the two of us in that fragile space. She looked at me, and I felt as if time had stopped. There was a conflict in her eyes, a struggle between reason and feeling. The moment seemed like an eternity. I realized we may have crossed a line, but I couldn't stop. She watched me intently, her face remaining a mystery, until suddenly she leaned closer, her lips gently touching mine. This kiss was different. Where before there had been hesitation, now there was a strength she could no longer contain. Her arms wrapped around my neck, and I pulled her closer. Our bodies made contact, the heat of her skin burning through me. I noticed her fingers trembling as she lifted her hand, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Her gesture was so simple, but there was tension in it. I wanted to touch her, to feel the warmth of her palm. Her hand gently touched mine, lingering a little longer, leaving a sensation of light warmth that traveled down my spine. That touch was more than just a gesture. She looked at me with an expression that made me feel my inner world crumble and rebuild itself anew. It was as if something important had just changed. I saw her breathing quicken, her lips open slightly. Her eyes searched my face for something: doubt, resistance, or maybe agreement. Fear and desire fought inside me, but something in her gaze was soothing, telling me that this moment was the only right one. But that first touch was followed by a wave that swallowed everything else. The kiss deepened, became more insistent, and I couldn't stop. My fingers touched her cheek and then slid lower, feeling her warmth. Her hand rested on my chest, and that touch burned through me. The room grew quieter and quieter, the world seemed to disappear, leaving the two of us alone. Only the sound of our rapid breaths filled the space, seeming louder than any noise. Her fingers slid lightly up my neck, leaving behind an electrifying sensation. It was like a dance without words, where every gesture spoke more than any phrase. When she pulled back a little, her forehead touched mine, and we both held our breath. There was more to that silence than 1,000 words. I could feel her trembling, but her gaze was filled with determination, almost desperate. Her hand still rested on my chest, and I covered it with my palm, squeezing it slowly to reassure her. She closed her eyes, as if struggling with an inner conflict. I watched her face, memorizing every moment. She stood up, took a few steps as if she were going to leave. But halfway there, she stopped and turned around. Our eyes met. There were so many emotions in her gaze that I couldn't read them all. It was a maelstrom: fear, desire, doubt, hope. And then she came back. This time without hesitation. Her lips covered mine, with renewed vigor. I wrapped my arms around her waist, feeling her body pressed against me as all barriers crumbled. At that moment, I realized there was no turning back. Morning caught up with me with the soft light filtering through the curtains and the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee. I came downstairs, still a little sleepy, but I noticed almost immediately how lively the kitchen was. Celine was standing at the stove, wearing my t-shirt, which was too big to hide her silhouette, but sitting on it so casually that it made me uncomfortable. Breakfast was already on the table, and I froze as I surveyed the splendor. Crispy toast with a golden crust, scrambled eggs with greens and cheese, a plate of fresh fruit slices, and 2 steaming cups of coffee. Nearby was a vase of flowers that she had apparently retrieved from the garden. There was a sense of care in that simple gesture that cut me more deeply than anything before. She turned around, catching my presence. Something like alarm flashed across Celine's face, but it was immediately replaced by a soft smile. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm, but I could feel the tension between us. "Morning," I replied, stepping closer and pouring myself a glass of water. We were silent. The air was saturated with unspoken words, every glance seemed to demand that we continue talking, but we both hesitated. Finally, I decided to lighten the mood. "Breakfast looks amazing. This, for me?" She nodded, shrugging her shoulders slightly. I sat down at the table and took my first sip of coffee. It was unexpectedly nice to know that someone had worked so hard for me. The whole day passed in a quiet rhythm. Celine tended to the garden, occasionally throwing brief glances in my direction when she thought I wasn't noticing. The evening brought with it coziness and a certain swagger. We met again in the kitchen, as if by unspoken agreement. "Why don't we have dinner together?" I suggested, raising the glass of wine she'd poured before. "Just you and me, out of sight." Her gaze softened, but she quickly raised her glass, as if to hide the emotion. She grinned, and I realized she liked my idea. We spent the evening chopping vegetables, making pasta, and laughing at each other's clumsy movements. The heat from the stove and the faint light from the kitchen lamp created a cozy atmosphere that seemed to shut us off from the rest of the world. After the second glass of wine, she became a little more relaxed. Her laughter was soft, like music, and I noticed the warmth in her gaze being replaced by something deeper, almost anxious. "No one can find out about this," she said when we finished dinner. Her voice was low and a little strained. I nodded, realizing what she was talking about. Celine and I had crossed that line beyond which there was chaos. Her words sounded not like a request, but a warning. As the evening drew to a close, I was alone in the living room, immersed in my thoughts. The sound of Celine's footsteps coming down the stairs made me look up. She came toward me, her face serious but her eyes a strange mixture of desperation and determination. "Do you still want to go on with this?" she asked. "Do you?" Instead of answering, she moved closer, her hand on my shoulder. I could see something in her gaze that I couldn't quite make out. Her lips were ready to say something important, but the front door slammed. We both turned around, and a chilling sense of reality hit me. My father was standing on the doorstep. His gaze darted between us, and it was clear from his face that he understood everything we'd failed to conceal. Now our connection was exposed like a severed nerve, and I was ashamed of him.